In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories.
With that, we're prepared for opening statements. To the state.
Good morning, respected members of the jury. This case is about the murder of a 70-year-old, hard-working, loving father who was murdered by his greedy, scheming 22-year-old wife. We are here to seek justice for Mr. Ramirez and his family. Why would this attractive young woman kill her own husband? Money. She did it for the $10 million she was about to lose out on. See, Mr. Ramirez was about to divorce her. She was about to lose $10 million that she would inherit, being Mr. Ramirez's wife if he died. She was greedy and desperate to keep the money, so she planned and schemed and decided that her husband needed to die before he could divorce her. Mrs. Ramirez, the defendant in this case, killed her husband for his millions. However, the story does not end there. She was stuck in a loveless marriage of convenience. She was a young, vibrant 22-year-old married to a 70-year-old man. They often slept apart. So she hatched a plan where she could have it all: a new lover and millions of dollars. The day of the murder, she went to be with a lover at a hotel. That night, they went back to Mr. Ramirez's house. She carried out her scheme that she believed would help her keep the $10 million. What she did was cold and calculated. She shot her husband with his own gun. Then, she and her lover fled. Hours later, she returned to the scene of the crime and claimed that she had not been there when the crime occurred. You may be asking, how do we know that this information is true? Members of the jury, the evidence and facts in this case make it clear that the defendant, Mrs. Ramirez, is guilty of murdering her husband. In her own statement, the defendant stated that on July 10th, the evening of the murder, she left her house at around 5 p.m. to go to her sister's home, and on the way, she planned to stop by her financial advisor's office to review some financial documents. However, what the evidence actually shows is that the defendant went to the Century Hotel. At trial, you will see the hotel receipt showing that the defendant checked into the Century Hotel the evening of the murder. Our claim is that Mrs. Ramirez did not check into the hotel by herself. It's our contention that she checked into the Century Hotel with her lover, Mr. Piper. Now, how can we establish that Mr. Piper and Mrs. Ramirez were involved in a personal relationship? The evidence speaks for itself. In her statement, Amy Vincent, the Ramirez's housekeeper, stated that on one occasion, she walked in on the defendant and Mr. Piper while they were standing close together. She stated that although she did not see them kiss, she swears that if she had walked in a minute later, they would have been kissing. Mrs. Ramirez was stuck in a loveless marriage with a man she often did not sleep with and was more than 3 times her age. The evidence shows that the pieces of the puzzle fit together. There is no legitimate reason for Mrs. Ramirez to have checked into a hotel the evening of the murder, if not to be with her lover, Mr. Piper, and to finalize her plans to kill her husband. Mrs. Ramirez was aware that Mr. Piper knew all the important financial information regarding her husband's money and what she stood to lose if her husband had divorced her. Whether she was manipulating Mr. Piper for her convenience or actually cared for him is irrelevant. What is relevant is that she used him to carry out her scheme to murder her husband so that she could inherit $10 million upon her husband's death. The night of the murder, July 10th, the defendant and Mr. Piper returned to Mr. Ramirez's house, where she killed her husband with his own gun. The defendant killed her husband to avoid being cut out of $10 million. The evidence is clear on this point. Divorce papers signed by the defendant were found at the scene of the crime. If the papers had been filed in court and the divorce had gone through, the defendant would have lost out on $10 million. Then, Mrs. Ramirez and Mr. Piper fled the scene. In the defendant's statement, she stated that she returned home at about 3 a.m. as a way of showing she was not there at the time of the murder. However, what the defendant and Mr. Piper did not account for was the next-door neighbor, Mr. James Johnson. Mr. Johnson was awake when he spotted a man and a woman next door at Mr. Ramirez's house between 11 and 11:15 p.m. According to the coroner, he placed the time of death for Mr. Ramirez at 11 p.m. on July 10th. Mr. Johnson spotted a man and a woman at Mr. Ramirez's house at the exact time of death is determined by the coroner. It's our position that the man and woman witnessed by the neighbor, Mr. Johnson, were the defendant and Mr. Piper. Again, the evidence clearly points to the defendant killing her husband. Although Mr. Johnson did not see the faces of the man and woman present at the time when Mr. Ramirez was killed, the trail of evidence points directly to the defendant. She had the most to lose. Her husband was about to divorce her and cut her out of $10 million. So she came up with a plan of how to get her hands on the money and thought she could get away with it. The defense may argue that there was no proof that the defendant and Mr. Piper were at the hotel together. Even though there was no surveillance footage that shows Mr. Piper and the defendant together at the hotel, it's still evident that they were there together. First, the hotel receipt shows that the defendant was at the hotel. Second, their inconsistent statements regarding the time of day they met indicates they were together most of the evening and night. Recall that the defendant stated that she went to meet Mr. Piper at 5 p.m. But based on Mr. Piper's statement, they met at night, after the time of the murder. In his statement, he specifically stated that, quote, Mrs. Ramirez and I were discussing some financial documents and investment opportunities on the night of Mr. Allen's murder. She did not appear to be upset or nervous at all, just her usual calm self. I certainly wouldn't expect someone who shot her husband to be so composed, end quote. It is reasonable to conclude that they were together throughout the entire night. Therefore, it is clear that they would have been together at the hotel. The defense may also argue that it may have been Mr. Nguyen who killed Mr. Ramirez. Although in his statement, Mr. Nguyen admitted he went to Mr. Ramirez's house to steal a few items to later sell, he did not kill Mr. Ramirez. The reason Mr. Nguyen went to steal from Mr. Ramirez's house is because Eric Ramirez, Mr. Ramirez's son, encouraged Mr. Nguyen to do so. So the fact that Mr. Nguyen's hat and strand of hair were found at the scene of the crime is not surprising. Nor is it surprising that his fingerprints were found on the paintings he stole. In addition, Mr. Nguyen passed a voluntary lie detector test stating he did not kill Mr. Ramirez. Additionally, an important fact revealed through examining Mr. Nguyen's statement is that it placed the defendant at the scene of the crime at night. Also, Eric Ramirez instructed Mr. Nguyen to go to Mr. Ramirez's house to steal the items when Mr. Ramirez would be asleep and home alone during the night. Not surprisingly, Mr. Nguyen stated that Mrs. Ramirez was exiting the house at the same time he was arriving and waved him in. His statement places Mrs. Ramirez leaving the house during the night of the murder. This evidence lends support to our position that the defendant killed Mr. Ramirez. Another argument the defense may present is that Gehrig Beas may be the killer because he lied about knowing Mr. Nguyen, instructed Mr. Nguyen to steal from Mr. Ramirez's house, and pawned several of the stolen items. Although he instructed Mr. Nguyen to steal the items from his father's house and then split the profits from selling the items, he more than likely did this to pay off his gambling debts. Despite his lies and misdeeds, Gehrig Beas loved his father. In her statement, his sister Emma was very clear that there was no way Gehrig could have been the one to kill her father, because her father and Gehrig never fought. In addition, the housekeeper also stated that even though Gehrig had issues and she never witnessed Gehrig threaten or argue with his father. Now, based on his sister's, the housekeeper's, and his own statement, it is clear that Gehrig loved his father and did not kill him. However, he likely refused to take the lie detector test because he knew he had lied about knowing Mr. Nguyen and had stolen from his father. Clearly, Gehrig Beas made mistakes, and he had gambling debt problems. But it's also just as clear that he loved his father. Therefore, the fact that the 11-inch pistol he gifted his father was used to kill his father does not make Gehrig Beas a killer. Similarly, the fact that Gehrig Beas' scarf was found at the scene of the crime does not make him a murderer. In addition, Gehrig stated that he rarely used the scarf found at the murder scene, and Mr. Ramirez was the last one to use it. An additional argument the defense may put forth is that Emma Ramirez may have killed her father. The defense may say Emma Ramirez was angry at her father for wanting her to remain in psychiatric care, and that she may have lashed out and killed him regarding the situation. The defense may also argue that according to Mr. Piper's statement, Mr. Ramirez threatened to remove Emma from his will if she did not successfully complete psychiatric and rehabilitative treatment. In other words, the argument is Emma killed her father out of anger due to the threat of excluding her from the will. However, any statement made by Mr. Piper is unreliable and biased due to his personal relationship with the defendant. Emma had her own personal problems and issues with her father, but she loved him and stated so clearly in her statement. Yet another argument the defense may raise is that James Johnson, Mr. Ramirez's neighbor, may have killed him. Although he was arrested once for a nonviolent crime, all charges were dropped. The defense may also say he has had a bad reputation in the neighborhood because he is often seen walking around late at night. However, in Mr. Johnson's statement, he clarified that he has insomnia and goes for walks at night according to his doctor's recommendation. Lastly, the defense may argue that the murder weapon has no prints on it, and therefore it cannot be proven that the defendant killed her husband with it. However, since the defendant was clearly intelligent enough to plan the murder of her husband, it's not surprising that she would have taken care not to leave her fingerprints on the gun. Even without her fingerprints on the gun, all the evidence presented points to Mrs. Ramirez being guilty of killing her husband. Respected members of the jury, there is more than enough evidence in this case to find the defendant, Mrs. Ramirez, guilty of murdering her husband. The fact of the matter is that she had the most to lose due to the impending divorce. So she took matters into her own hands to ensure that she would get her $10 million. It is now in your hands to bring justice to Mr. Ramirez and his family. I ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder. Thank you.
Thank you.